Hi, everyone. It's Matt Burns, today's guest host of the HRchat Podcast. In this episode, we're going to focus on all things talent management, learning technology, and relentless intention. My guest today, Christopher Lind, the VP and Chief Learning Officer at ChenMed. Chris is also the host of the popular Learning Tech Talks podcast and the founder of Learning Sharks, a firm that supports organizations with comprehensive, unbiased advisory on all things learning innovation and technology. Chris, welcome to the HR Chat Show.
Hey, thank you for having me. And I don't know how to respond to saying the popular learning tech talk. I mean, wow, it's such a compliment and we're just getting started.
I may have overstated that. I mean, I think it's a great show. We joke, Chris, but I was there in the very beginning when you were talking about launching the podcast, and we've been friends now for a few years. I am a big fan of the work that you're doing, a big fan of all the things that you're doing, both at ChenMed, but certainly with Learning Tech Talks and Learning Sharks. Today's conversation, we're going to get into all of that and much, much more. But I think first and foremost, I'd love to get into one question that's been eating away at me. If you could just introduce ChenMed and tell our listeners a bit about the mission of the organization.
Yeah. And they're probably, if anyone there actually listens to this, they'll probably ding me for not saying it exactly right, because we actually have the official mission, which, let's see if I can get it. It's to honor seniors with affordable VIP care that delivers better health. I think that is the official mission. I'm trying to remember because we've got the vision, the mission, and the core model. But ultimately, if I were to break it down into layman's terms, the company is committed to transforming healthcare for underserved populations in the US, which is just a grossly neglected group of people. The US healthcare system is already broken as it is, but then you stack on top of it, if you are in a underserved area, there's just really, it's pretty dismal. And so they've made it intentional to say, let's go in and we can do better. We can do better, which is pretty awesome.
Well, in your role, VP, Chief Learning Officer, it's an exciting role. I mean, you're supporting a segment that is going through a massive amount of digital transformation, a skill set, whether that be doctors, nurses, and staff of all shapes and sizes and types and experience levels. You're supporting them through their transition. What's a day in the life of the VP and Chief Learning Officer look like at ChenMed?
Oh, man. So a lot of my time, honestly, is spent prioritizing. It really is spent prioritizing and staying connected to the workforce. One of the biggest challenges we've had is I've been here 2 years now, just over 2 years. And when I joined, we were 1,500 people, and now we're 6,000 plus.
Oh, wow.
So just massive growth. We've expanded, lots of new people. And as you can imagine with that means there's a lot of new people in the organization. The company's had to change not its model, but just the way it operates. It's not a small organization anymore. It's a big enterprise. And so a lot of that is just trying to understand what exactly are we trying to accomplish here, and what do people need to know to do that really well. And a lot of that is navigating these priorities and making sure we're not pushing stuff from the top that isn't landing on the ground.
Alongside the industry changes, one thing that's massively shifted in the broader HR realm is, of course, learning and development. I think back to my 20 years in the profession, back in the days, and please don't hate me, Chris, for saying this, but presentations built on PowerPoint slides and, learning technology that was really consisted of Excel and PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. We're now at a place where the technology really is the leading force. And that's one area that you and I connected on very early on, was just your innovative spirit around trying to work through the learning and development strategy a little bit differently. What first drew you to learning and technology more broadly, and then maybe more specifically, learning and technology to combine together?
So I originally everybody thought I was going to be a software engineer. I was a total geek when it came to programming. And I thought it was boring, to be honest. It was too predictable. Numbers were very predictable. So you could look at it, you wrote the code, you knew what the code was going to do. It wasn't really all that interesting. And so I talked to my advisors about it and was fascinated by people. I'd always had an interest in human psychology and development. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. Maybe that'll be more fun than technology. So I actually shifted gears and went into teaching. Nobody really knew what to do with me. So I ended up teaching technology. And it just wasn't a good fit. I'm like, there's still not something right about this. And that's how I ended up getting into the corporate space, where I was looking at, okay, ultimately we have to develop people which are fascinating and unpredictable and changing all the time. And really the only way you can keep pace with that is with tech. And so for me, tech was always something that I was looking at, going like, all these rudimentary, arbitrary barriers we place upon it. Oh, well, we have to do this or we have to do this. I was looking at it going, no, we don't, because we could solve it with this and we could solve it with that, or we could use this to solve it. So really it just became a merge of the two.
Well, and I know one thing for you in particular that you're known for, something that we've talked a lot about offline, is the importance of connecting learning strategy to broader organizational strategy. We think about how learning supports the growth. You guys have quadrupled in size in the last couple of years. That's an incredible growth trajectory for any organization. But when I think about the highly regulated, very unique skill sets in the healthcare sector, I start to think about all the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours that have to go into developing a workforce, keeping it skilled, upskilling it. And then as you introduce more and more innovation and technology into the workplace, bringing that workforce along with that shift, how do you, as a chief learning officer, pair your learning strategy, your learning technology strategy with a broader organization strategy to make sure that it's in full alignment?
So I didn't grow up in HR, which I think in some ways helped. Not a knock on HR at all, but I just came from a different vantage point because I was in the ops side of the house. I'd always spent my time in ops and different operational functions. And so to me, I'd always been probing into, at the end of the day, all of us are just trying to solve a business problem. I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're all trying to solve business problems. My lens was just always, well, but at the end of the day, we need people to solve that problem. So what do we need them to do to solve that problem? So in terms of staying connected to that, I mean, that's just part of my repertoire, is hanging out with my ops leaders and my business counterparts going, what are you really trying to do? And I'm close enough to the C-suite that I spend a lot of time talking to them about, like, why are we trying to knock this way? Or why are we trying to go in that direction? So that I can help them go, you stop worrying about how you make the people do it. Don't you worry about that. You stay laser focused on, if you're the chief clinical officer, what's happening in the medical or healthcare space. What is that gap or that challenge that we're trying? Let me figure out, okay, where are people today and what do we need them doing differently tomorrow as a result of that? And so again, going back to the relationship, it's just, we've got different lanes, but we're all looking at the same thing.
You're looking at the same thing, but I would argue that your challenge is probably one of the greater challenges on that C-suite group, that at the board, at the table. You're talking about making a shift into technology and modalities that are foreign to a lot of executives. You mentioned early on, Chris, in this conversation, just how broken healthcare is in the United States. I'd lump education right into that pile of traditional enterprise or traditional modalities that are in need of a refresh. How do you consider the growth of broader education, and how do you stay on top of the latest trends, knowing that whether it's virtual reality or augmented reality or artificial intelligence, it seems like every other day a new tool is entering into the market purporting to be able to provide better learning experience or to increase learning retention, learning engagement. How do you source what is working, what's not working, and how do you figure out how to stay on top of everything?
So some of it, people ask a lot. They go, how do you manage to run your podcast and do this other stuff and, do these other things? And to me, it's, well, they're one and of the same. Sure. They're the same thing. They're not in conflict with each other. In many ways, I am doing what I should be doing as an executive by saying, all right, what's happening in the industry? What are my peers doing? What are the vendors doing? How are they solving these problems? So I dedicate a portion of my time to that. It just happens to be I broadcast some of it because other people find value in that. So I think that's been one way in staying on top of it, because the reality is the market is confusing as all get out. I mean, it's every week there's some new market category coming out claiming it. This is the next latest and greatest, whatever. So some of it, I'll admit, my technical background helps tremendously. I can cut through the fluff much easier than maybe somebody with a less technical background. Somebody can try and dazzle me with AI and spirit fingers. And I'm like, okay, but let's talk about what your algorithms are doing and how are they actually pinpointing the skill gaps and how are you tying? And they're like, I thought we could just say AI and you would be fine with whatever that is. So that helps, which is also why I started the podcast, because I recognized a lot of people, they couldn't translate that. And so the goal was to help with that. So I think some of it's that, but ultimately going back to making sure that you're looking at what are we really trying to solve for? There's a misnomer that if you get the right tech, it's going to fix the problem. Well, it's not. The tech's not going to fix the problem. You got to know what the problem is and what kind of things you need to try and solve that problem. Well, then you do that. Going and looking at the tech market, it's much easier to go, can you do this thing? You can't. Okay. That's not the right solution for this problem then.
I think you're spot on. And I think one of the challenges that's affected L&D for as long as I've been in the HR profession is the idea of measurement. There's lots of good programs out there where, again, they purport to solve all the world's problems. They have great UI, they have great marketing campaigns, slick salespeople that can tell you that they can solve everything that you have problems for. But it really comes down to measurement. And when you're sitting at that, C-suite table, talking to your CFO, talking to your CFO, talking to your board, they want bottom line results for the investments they're making in their people. I'm curious, that technical background you talked about, does that come into play as well around measurement? And if so, how does it play a role in your broader capacity as CLO?
Yeah, it does in the sense that it helps me know what can be measured and how. So I usually don't have to put a whole lot of thought into, okay, so how would we do it? But I think one of the fundamental misses when it comes to measurement that sometimes I ruffle feathers with my business counterparts is I think a lot of leaders in my seat have historically assumed, well, if somebody's coming to me, they've already thought through the problem and what they're trying to do. And that's not always the case. They may not, this is an HR podcast. We all know this, that our business counterparts don't always come to us with a clearly defined problem statement of here's exactly what we're trying to do and what good looks like on the other side. And I think that's where I end up going into a lot of conversations that don't always start off really well, where it's like, listen, I'm not fighting you. I just need to get to the bottom of what are we actually trying to measure so that I can identify what data points might we be able to pull from, what sources, what kind of data gaps do we have that then I can fill with other technology solutions to try and bridge that gap. And I think that makes a big difference. It absolutely affects the measurement conversation though.
You can't see because my hands are off screen right now, but I have a thin layer of perspiration forming because I'm thinking about all the old conversations I had with CEOs and boards about learning and development. And Chris, you know this, the first thing that's often cut in times of recession or in times of downturns is learning. And at the same time, I've sat through countless conversations where we had a problem performer in an organization. And the first idea was put them in more training, it'll fix the problem. And so organizations, to your point, organizations and their leaders don't often understand the true problem set. They don't really understand learning strategy, learning technology, and how it affects at the individual, at the team, and the organizational level. In your role as chief learning officer, I'm sure part of your capacity is education within the broader organization in terms of what's possible, what's not possible. Maybe talk a bit about how you manage stakeholders in establishing your mandate and seeing it through to completion.
Yeah. So, here's a good example of one. I recently had a business leader who had pinged me and he'd run into a problem and he'd said, could we use VR for this? Again, a well-intended question. There is a legitimate problem type of a thing. And so I dug into it and just, I don't know if he was expecting this as a response, but I ended up recording a 90-minute response to what he'd asked in a simple question of, here are the different problem sets that we may need to consider. Here are the different interventions. Here's how we may think about it. These are the different solutions we could look at. Just broke the whole thing down to the point where I didn't even have to say it. He went back to the drawing board and went, I don't think I know what I'm trying to solve for yet enough to even bring this to you. And that ended up leading to a really powerful conversation because I said, well, let me help you with that. Like, you don't need to go do that on your own. Let me participate in this. But I think it was helpful in terms of saying, like, yeah, I do need to educate you on this because it is complicated. It is very, very complicated.
As a lot of problems are today. And I'm not going to miss an opportunity to talk about virtual reality. You opened the door, Chris. I'm going to jump right through it.
You think that wasn't intentional?
Yeah, I know it was intentional. In 2020, you and I partnered on the Global HR Summit. It was a 3-day conference that brought together 60 HR and business leaders from around the world to speak about all things culture, human resources, and the modality was unique. We used virtual reality as our delivery tool to be able to cascade that message to 800 people, of which 400 of them were in avatars, in headsets, participating in a alt space venue put on by Microsoft. It was truly a unique event, probably ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And as we flash forward 3 years from now, one of the things I'm most proud of, Chris, is that of the 60 speakers that were at that event, 15 of them went on to introduce virtual reality into their organizations, including yourself. I'd love to know a bit more about your relationship with virtual reality. I know that when I bugged you in 2020, it wasn't your first dance. You had played with the technology before, you'd experimented with it before on a personal basis. What's been your history with virtual reality, and what does it look like today at ChenMed?
So if I were to go back a bit, because there's virtual reality, then there's extended reality, which is the broader category. And
yes,
I've been playing with the extended reality space for 15 years, in terms of how can we leverage this immersive digital layer of technology in our real world type of a thing. So, as it came into 2020 and even a little bit before that, already had been doing some work around, really heavily around simulation work. And I think one of the gaps that, or misses a lot of people think, is when they think simulations, they think, oh, well, we don't do manufacturing, or we don't do high risk, active shooter training, things like that. And it's like, well, right, but you do have human interactions. So you do simulations, or there's benefit to that. So even before the chance we got to do the conference together, we were running VR sims, and I would call it hybrid VR. We weren't using the headsets because just the infrastructure was not there yet. But for simulation based stuff, how do you actually have people simulate environments and experiences? Going back to the way you build skills is through practice. You don't build skills by having somebody watch a fancy YouTube video. You have them build skills by doing something with it. And so we were using this heavily for our sales training, in terms of how do you actually simulate a conversation with a physician. Now, this was before I was with ChenMed. Coming to ChenMed, I was back at ground zero. This was new territory for this organization. And our IT org is not, for anybody exploring the tech, if you want to play with the hardware, you better team up with some of your IT partners or something like that and see where you are. Because you're not going to get the CFO's buy-in to be like, can we buy headsets for everyone to roll out for a training? They're going to laugh you out of the room. So you do have to think about, okay, how are we approaching this? Which the good news is XR technology does not all require a headset. So even here where we've started, because now that we're getting into this a little bit more, I've hired somebody who's basically an XR programmer who can design these things for us. And some of the things we're doing now is even just digital twin technology, where one of the things that we lack is we've gotten huge, and many people don't get exposure to our home office or some of these locations of how workflows happen. Well, we can't, it doesn't make sense with the size we are now to fly everybody in all the time. So we're using immersive tech to create digital twins of our real locations that you can then navigate through. Now, could you do it in a headset? Yeah. Would it be a way cooler experience? Sure. But can you also do it from a mobile device or from your desk? Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I'm doing now with my teams is how do we introduce the organization to the possibilities? Because there still are a lot of myths and wrong mindsets about what VR really is for.
No, you couldn't be more right on that. As somebody who tried to sell a conference in 2020, I can speak to the scars I still have in my body. They're fresh. It's the reputation of virtual reality. And to be fair to the technology, it's been around for 50 years. Our opening speaker at the conference was Tom Furness, and he invented the technology 50 years ago for the US Air Force for cockpit simulations. We flash forward now, the technology is predominantly being used in use cases like gaming, and to your point, in enterprise applications for manufacturing or in high stress roles. We had one of our speakers who actually does the training at a Georgian college outside of Toronto. They're doing paramedic training where they're actually titrating traumatic situations to first responders so that when they're actually faced with real life situations, they're not going to be as exposed to the shock that could be associated with a motor vehicle accident or a fatality, and things that most of us take for granted, but that some of the folks in our society experience on a near daily basis. And I think to your point, that the power of a technology really lies in its ability to simulate and replicate real life examples such that you can create examples for folks to be able to experience things in a safe environment where you can pause, you can rewind, you can play things back, you can do things in a very safe, secure, comforting, and confident environment such that people don't worry about making mistakes. If I'm involved, to your point, in an active shooter situation as a law enforcement officer, I'd love to have that training be done first in simulation than on the first day on my job. I'd love to be able to
as we've seen in the news, we can see what happens when this goes wrong. It's catastrophic.
Exactly. Catastrophic. And again, not to allow for too much of the both sides of the story conversation, but I think part of that can be attributed to the fact that most of us have never been put in that situation before. And when people feel as if they aren't able to act as they normally would when they're in high stress situations, they make mistakes they wouldn't otherwise make. And I think virtual reality creates an environment where such that people can have those experiences and do so in a safe way. But I think those are extreme examples, Chris. I also think about the organizations now that are most invested in virtual reality, and their names that you and I recognize: McDonald's, Amazon, Yum Brands, which includes KFC and
Johnson
Taco
and
Bell,
Johnson is doing
Johnson
tons
and Johnson,
of stuff.
Accenture, organizations that have the capital to invest in, as you mentioned, in the infrastructure that are going to reap the benefits of experiential learning. I know that you mentioned this before, but individuals do not learn through lectures and PowerPoints. They don't learn through passive consumption of data. They learn through experiential learning, particularly adults. So when we put those in tools in people's hands, we increase engagement, we increase retention. And when it comes to things like health and safety or customer service or interpersonal team skills, these are things that most organizations need to get right. And I think about, Chris, an environment where demographically speaking, at least in North America, we're entering into a really odd phase. I've been in HR for 20 years. I've been hearing about the inevitable retirement of the baby boomers for as long as I've been in this profession.
The great tsunami is coming.
It's here. And every single day, more people leave the workforce than enter it. And as a consequence of that, we have to worry about things like knowledge transfer. We have to worry about things like knowledge retention. We have to build skills such that our workforce, being more transient, has to be able to respond to present day realities. And I would suggest that in most cases, the tools aren't fit for purpose. And who is going to suffer from that will be organizations, their employees, and their customers.
I mean, it's money. It's lost money. That's the reality of it.
And that makes a very strong financial case for a technology that has traditionally been operating at the peripheries. You mentioned that you've been using it to create digital twins. I think that's a really exciting use case. What do you see next at ChenMed when it comes to virtual reality? What's a pet project maybe that you have your eye on, that you're toying around with? And I'm not looking for you to socialize something for the first time on this podcast, Chris, but what are you thinking about in the future?
Some of the things that I think are probably the most important for me is going back to our measurement conversation. Not only does it give us an opportunity to expose and give people a chance to build skills, but quantifiably build skills that we can then see how are people actually performing with this. So what I'm really watching for right now, we need the hardware space to mature a little bit. We're kind of in the 90s Pentium days when it comes to the hardware, where you're like, how do I buy a new computer? Or do I wait? Type of a thing. So I think that's leading to some challenges. But what we're seeing with the advancement of generative AI, combining that with virtual reality technology and being able to say, we're coming very quickly to a point where you can have a pseudo-human interaction completely encapsulated in a VR experience. If you've ever interacted with VR or an AI bot in the past, it did not feel terribly realistic. But if you played around with ChatGPT, it actually can feel like you're talking to someone. So you start combining that with VR technology, and now you can recreate things like customer simulations, de-escalating. I mean, for me, when I think about we're dealing with tough populations in tough areas, that's not something you want happening, and it's your first exposure to it. So thinking about, as a physician, how do you handle a really challenging situation, knowing that VIP service is your primary goal? Well, you don't practice that and hope you get it right on real people. You do that in this world. And so I think that's where a lot of these interpersonal skills, being able to actually give people an opportunity to do it in an authentic environment, I'm pushing hard for us to get there. But again, going back to Are there still a lot of misunderstandings? And is the hardware space in a spot where it's still a little tough? So that's where we're treading carefully while at the same time laying the foundation, which is usually how I go anyway.
I think that's the right approach. And I think it's worth pointing out that the world has fundamentally shifted in a couple of different ways. So I think back to, again, 20 years ago, young Matt Burns is figuring out his career. I had the benefit of baby boomers as coaches and contemporaries that were able to coach me and counsel me and expose me to limited amounts of interaction with clients. I was an HR business partner, one of my first corporate roles, where I'm advising business owners on employee relations issues that could be disciplinary or termination oriented, or in some cases, the inverse, hiring situations, and having to advise people that run multi-million-dollar businesses, and myself only having a few years of experience. There was often afternoons where I felt that imposter syndrome, or was certainly questioned by my stakeholders on who was I to provide that advice. And honestly, Chris, I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of errors in judgment. I started out trying to, position myself as confident and knowing everything, and realized pretty quickly that wasn't the right approach. Then I took a bit more of a vulnerable approach and found that I actually went too far the other perspective, and that people tended to walk all over me. And then with feedback and coaching and counseling, I was able to find the right blend that works for me, that's authentically me, and that ultimately best provides the best support for the organization and its stakeholders. I think about people entering the workforce now at a time when there's a mass exodus of talent, of experience, of knowledge. And I go, who are they going to turn to for support when they're making mistakes? I mean, Chris, 20 years ago, we didn't have social media. We didn't have cell phones. When you made a mistake, you could keep it isolated.
Can destroy your career.
The stakes are higher, they're much more amplified, and the margin for error is razor thin. So all of them are reason to make a case for things like simulation, things like supporting organizations and their leaders with, to your point, real life simulations that can replicate having that tough conversation with somebody who may be struggling to come to work on time, or having a discussion with somebody about how they may not be getting their full bonus this year because their performance wasn't standard. Things that most leaders really struggle to have those conversations about. And in some cases, I think we have this false narrative that people just figure this out on their own. My experience has been they don't figure it out. They work around it, Chris, and you know this. They find different ways to work around the requirement. They solve things themselves. They are unwilling to have tough conversations. They make small problems big problems.
And then these people move from frontline managers to senior managers, and they carry this behavior right with them. And that's why I think the merging of generative AI and VR technology is a huge revolution for what's going to come. Because before, there were challenges with, okay, we can create these simulations, but how do we make them feel authentic, yet still not requiring too many resources? And it was a tough mix. It really was. When I was doing simulations, it was still really resource intensive. With generative AI, we can come a long way in terms of being able to completely, using technology, give people real-time feedback on, hey, the way you I would not, and have it respond to you based on what you said. We're close. We're close, if not already there, for some very powerful solutions, which I would say are very much on the horizon.
Well, let's break this down a bit for our listeners and our viewers. So I think it's important, because I think, to your point, I'm with you on the generative AI being a massive leap forward. Let's put things in context. Before generative AI, most simulations in virtual reality, or any other modality for that matter, looked a lot like choose your own adventure.
Role play.
Role play. So you pick one of three scenarios. You go up to, let's just say I have an example where I worked with an organization and advised them, and they were building simulations for social workers that were going into high-risk homes and having conversations with parents, a challenging job at the best of times. And in those cases, they were preparing them for the inevitable objections, pushback, in some cases, violence. And they would say, okay, you're talking to a parent and this parent reacts violently. You're going to choose option A or option B. If you choose option A or option B, the simulation would replicate that experience. But to your point, with generative AI, you no longer have that option A, option B. You literally communicate with the simulation, and it will provide to you a response based on what you said. It is customized and tailored to the actual
and
words that you're using.
Personalize the environment around it. Because the way we used to get around this from a learning standpoint was we recognized that a choose your own adventure multiple choice quiz with an adaptive simulation, it honestly was clunky. It just really was, because you're like, well, really, would anybody actually say any of these three things? Maybe. So then you do role play, which not only is it not scalable, but it's hard to role play with something. If you and I were to sit and simulate something, I couldn't disconnect from the fact you're Matt Burns and I'd end up snickering about whatever it was. Versus now, the generative AI can actually take and dynamically change things. So you merge that, I mean, it's powerful.
It's powerful because, again, creates reality, which is ultimately going to lead to learning. And again, you have the opportunity to end the simulation, pause the simulation, play back the tape. And like athletes have been doing for years, from an athletic performance perspective, really break down piece by piece.
Where
This is
did
your
you
body
fall
language.
apart?
These are the words that you chose. Here's where your eye contact may have fallen apart. And you're able to address some of those opportunities with people and give them real tangible feedback without having it be a lawsuit or an unfortunate end case in a very highly volatile situation.
Yep.
Chris, I think about other technologies. I'm curious for yourself. You talked about generative AI, you talked about virtual reality. Is there anything else that's keeping you interested when it comes to the idea of the advancements around learning, technology or otherwise? What's something you're excited about when it comes to innovations in the broader enterprise learning space?
I think one of the underutilized ones I'm not hearing enough in the space, there are some players, a handful come to mind, who are really innovating in this space, is using machine learning for analytical insights. There's a lot of tech out there that are claiming insights and analytics, and really it's just dashboarding. And it's taking data and presenting it visually. But what I'm seeing more of, and I'm excited about, is we are creating so much data that no human being can even accurately look at it and evaluate what it is. I mean, even just going back to our example of VR tied with generative AI, the amount of data that gets created through a 10-minute simulation is exponential. So to think that somebody's ever going to go back and look at that and we can't even get people to go back and look at their performance reviews, right? Like we can't even get people to do that. So to think somebody's going to debrief and deconstruct a 10-minute VR simulation, it's not there, but machine learning can. And so I'm seeing some players who are really playing with this, not to start making decisions, but to be scouring and combing through this data and coming up, identifying patterns and trends and presenting people with those going, hey, is this something that you should be paying attention to? And I think that's exciting because that's going to give us greater visibility into people's skills. It's going to help us make better decisions. It's going to help us be able to actually look at, are we really doing things based on data, or are we doing them based on our personal preference and then finding data to convince us that we're doing the right thing?
More often than not, it's the latter. And that's where we run into challenges. And I agree, data becomes a really compelling tool in amongst many other organizations. And I think, when I talk to leaders now about the use of analytics, whether it's in my own organization or on this podcast, it's usually in the context of using data as a complement to experience, to the lessons they've learned throughout their career. We're not saying that people need to just lean on the data blindly. It's meant to be another voice on the table.
I would plead, don't do that. There are solutions out there being like, hey, we can make these decisions for you. You need the human in the loop. You absolutely need the human in the loop. But can it at least get you to quicker insights that you can then make decisions on? Yes. And is it going to provide you with insights you would have never in your lifetime been able to identify? Absolutely.
Speaking of never in my lifetime, I never thought in my lifetime you'd write a book. I remember sitting with you over the last several years, talking about all the things that you were going to do, and of all the list of the many things that you were talking about, launching a podcast, launching an advisory firm. I never once heard Christopher Lind author. And yet you have a book coming out, Relentless Intention. Tell me a bit about the process to arrive at deciding A, to write the book, B, what it's about, and C, who's the audience you're intending to write it for?
Yeah. So I actually myself, the reason you didn't ever hear me talk about it was because I swore I never would. I said, I like creating content. I like writing short form things. I don't really have a book to write. And literally in the middle of the night, one night, I woke up and went, I have to write a book. I know what I have to write a book about. It's the conversations I have with people all the time. I just need to put this in one story so that others can learn from it. And so I you can ask my wife about it. She's still like, I remember you jumped out of bed and you ran to your office and started jotting down like, and this is the chapter and this is the title and this is all this stuff. Cause it just kind of hit me. So yeah, the book is Relentless Intention. And really what it is having lived at the center of family, career, and business, family, career, and tech in a very odd way, I often see that some of the biggest things that hold us up are we don't really truly understand our purpose. We don't understand the purpose of what we're doing. And so we're operating off of false pretenses and we're operating around barriers that aren't really there, and being able to help drive people to what are you actually trying to accomplish? Like, can we get to the core of your intention? Because if you can get to the core of that, you have so much more latitude in what you can accomplish and the way you can reimagine the possibilities when you do it right. And so that's what it was. It's a combination of both personal and professional reflections on how I've navigated life and hopefully help others be able to see life through that same lens.
Well, speaking of your wife, I know she's a source of a lot of inspiration on your book. I know she makes you 10 times better than you actually are in real life. And I think the book's going to represent that as well. She's really been helping in terms of bringing together all these disparate ideas, helping with the strategy behind it. You know, you guys have a really special relationship, 7 children, you working full-time, podcast, advisory. I mean, you talk about having a busy life, Chris. You've certainly on the short list of people that I know who are juggling many different things. What role does your relationship play in making all that stuff kind of work and come together?
So she's the yin to my yang. It is really the best way I can describe it, in the sense that we are not alike. And that's a good thing. You know, a lot of times that causes conflict, but we figured out how to go, no, but this is an asset to us because you see the things I don't see and I see the things you don't see. And instead of getting defensive about that, we can use that to push each other forward. And so I think that's, you know, whether it's my work, she's the one who tells me you're getting off track. You've lost your intention. I know your intention and you're off your intention and you need to get back on it. She's the one who helps rein me in when I get a little too sucked into my work and my career and goes, don't forget, you grew up in a funeral home. You got 7 kids. What's more important? You know, and then boom, like bam, she brings me right back. So yeah, it's, I couldn't do it without her, to be honest.
And, you know, major props to your partner. We've talked about her. I one day would love to meet her because I know that she is the brains behind the genius that is Christopher Lind. You know, you've accomplished so much in the short period of time. You know, Chris, what's next for you? What are you thinking about for the balance of 2023? I know you have the book coming out. You've got 7 kids. You got a full-time job. You got a podcast. You got an advisory consulting firm. Anything else you're thinking about for 2023?
You know, I'm more one of those, I always have an intention and I don't really know what the plan is. And I let the plan play itself out. And so my intention still continues to be, I want to influence the way every company in the world develops their people. So what that looks like next, I'm not quite sure, but I'm just taking it one step at a time and enjoying life along the way.
So for those who are interested, and I'm sure people who've been listening to this podcast are fascinated by how you make all this stuff come together, where can folks learn a bit more about ChenMed, Christopher Lind, the podcast? Where can we get more details about that?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously ChenMed's got their website up. You can find out all about them there. In terms of me, I'm extremely active on LinkedIn. So I'm actually usually more responsive to that than you call my phone, you may or may not get me. You message me on LinkedIn, you'll actually get me. And then I've got my website, Learning Sharks, which has any of my podcast episodes. I'm also building out a fairly robust set of content on YouTube, which is kind of one of my things for 2023 is stepping outside of just the learning tech brand and really trying to develop and coach people along the way. So it's not really coaching, just more so, hey, here's some more wisdom and insights on how to navigate this place.
My friend, always a pleasure connecting. Thank you so much for your time today and looking forward to having this chat again offline.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thanks so much for having me. Always enjoy our conversations.